aligning our attitude gyros in LEM, setting the 8-ball up and aligning the IMU, again, can be done with assistance from MISFIN and by star sighting. So I think the situation really is well in hand by the crew that's up there.
Thank you, Scott. Do you have any idea what they would be doing up there right now? Well, just what they're up to?
Well, let's see. Probably at this time they have aligned their IMU.
I hope they have better communications than that.
Pardon?
Scott,
yeah.
I don't know whether you can hear me. Nod your head if you can hear me.
Yes, I can.
Well, I can't hear you, which may be because your attitude is such that your antenna is out of line with us.
Possibly so.
There you are. Now you're back. We missed the answer to my question about whether you had any idea what they're doing right now. At least it didn't come through to us here in the center.
Yes, my guess would be that they have or are aligning the IMU and setting up their attitude gyro in preparation for the burn that will take place after they get around the moon.
Which is another 19 hours or so from now, I think.
Yes. What I was saying, Walter, is if you didn't hear me, I don't think that there's any great problem or great worry right now on the positive side of things.
Well, we're glad to have that from you, Scott. And I think we're getting that kind of encouraging report from several sources, including the fellows down in Houston. Wally Schirra had a question or a comment to make to you. Wally?
Scott, what I had heard as a report from Jim Lovell, the windows had some debris on them, and I think you should point out over your head there the optical sighting device that's used for the alignment, that the windows are merely used to get initial attitude reference, and then the precise measurements are done through the telescope. Can you point that out for us there?
This is the AOT, the alignment
well, what he's pointing at,
optical
of course, is a telescope. The window is just in back of his head as you see it from where we see it.
Scott, we've lost audio from you again, but as you point to these things, Wally will point out what you're doing. So why don't you just point around to what these items? Maybe you can lead him.
Yeah, what we're looking at there is the AOT, or the optical telescope, and it looks something like a periscope to us here, and it's not at all dissimilar. And that device couples into the onboard platform and computer so that they can, in fact, align the system much as they do in the command module. The windows in back you were what they were referring to as the items that had debris on them, and of course there's a window on either side, and Scott's reaching to the other side.
If they had debris on them, wouldn't the telescope have debris on it as well?
It's a very good question, and I'm waiting for that answer from Jim Lovell. I suspect we'll find it out that way.
Scott, I don't know whether we've got audio with you again or not.
Try me.
Now, this simulation is almost too real. This what we're hearing from Houston. They're having the same sort of problems with the actual spaceship. If you have your voice again, what's your answer to that? Do you think that the telescope would likely be interfered with if there is debris on the windows as well?
If you can read me, I'm not familiar with the debris problem. I don't know where it came from. There is an eye guard that's located on the eyepiece of the telescope, but I doubt that it would take any debris off. Can you hear me?
The debris apparently is outside the spacecraft. They said it seemed to have come from the initial problem, whatever they had, the earlier venting explosion or whatever. So it's apparently outside on the windows. But at least I guess we're going to have to wait till we get that question answered from Houston and from Jim Lovell himself, who must be in touch with Houston about the matter.
It's
now, I do have a
unfortunate.
report that the Navy says it has no ships in the Atlantic recovery area, The Coast Guard is continuing its check of merchant marine ships to see if there's anything down there. They would have 3 days, 4 days almost to get there till Friday morning early, and that is a busy merchant marine area, certainly along the coast of South America and between South America and Europe and West Africa. So the real problem of getting a ship there of some nature with 4 days to go, I shouldn't think would be that great one.
We have a whole, I would literally say, batch of contingency areas, contingency techniques. And all over the world, we have aircraft on alert that can be deployed with paramedics and parachute scuba divers who can go over the side taking survival equipment. And we've really never exercised that large net except on the case where Neil Armstrong and Dave Scott came in way out in the Pacific.
In Gemini 8.
In Gemini 8. And of course there we had a destroyer near enough and they were picked up quite soon. But we don't really need a ship there for the crew. It's the ship to pick up the vehicle. We could feasibly, if the sea state, meaning the surface of the sea isn't too rough, go in there with an amphibian aircraft and pick up the crew so that they wouldn't have to exist in this rather lousy boat. In fact, it's not a very good spacecraft at this point either, but I should add, and I'd like to amend that the command module apparently is in fine condition, so even that shouldn't be a constraint as far as recovery goes.
And they, of course, have their raft and survival equipment all there and can spend a great deal of time out on the ocean if it's not
if
too
it's
rough.
Required, surely.
To do it. But furthermore, there are rescue aircraft in the area
yes.
already. That contingency is always available, and there are 2 aircraft based down there that can handle that area very, very nicely and are there. But that's still something to be decided later. Actually, Mission Control has indicated quite clearly at Space Center that they prefer the Pacific landing, and if all goes well, as everyone hopes it will, of course, now, if there are no further emergencies, in other words, where they will come down right where they expected to come down, just a little south of the equator in mid-Pacific, and that time would be 12:13 p.m. Eastern Time on Friday. With the moon mission, as we have been reporting to you, now definitely scrubbed. There is no way to go to the moon and still come back safely, so of course they're not going to the moon, that is to the moon's surface. They are on the way to the moon. They do not have the power in that service propulsion system engine to abort the mission before going to the moon now. They were 205,000 miles from Earth when it happened, and here is Mission Control.
Kick what we got, but we'd like to get that Ping's power down as soon as possible. That'd be after the mid-course. And so how do you feel about making a 16 foot per second burn in 37 minutes?
Well, we'll give it a try, Jack, if that's all we got. That's a 16 foot per second dip burn in 37 minutes.
Roger, we're working up a pad for it, but we'd want to know what you think about doing it at that time.
Well, we'll do it. Can you give us a little bit more time?
Okay, Jim, we'd like to get a suggested time from you. We can figure out a free return maneuver for any time you want to give us. So if you'll give us the time you'd like to shoot for, we'll figure out a pad.
Okay, that sounds good. I think if we have a little bit more time, we want to do it right. Stand by one. Let's shoot for an hour if we can, Jack. How's that?
Okay, Jim, how about 61 hours and 30 minutes? That's an hour and 5 from now.
Okay, we'll do it. We want to be sure we talk back and forth now to make sure we get this burn off right.
Affirmed.
Okay, in the interim, Jack, looked around again and I saw that we have a radar and a landing radar heater breaker, and can I pull those out?
Affirmative, pull them both out. And now we want to ask you a question about alignments and so forth. We wanted to know if you can see any stars out of the AOT. We also wanted to know if you could use the service module to cast a shadow on the limb windows and then look out the windows to see stars for P51, COAS alignment.
Okay, in this attitude, Jack, that we're pitching around, I cannot use the AOT to see stars. We're just not able to see them at all. Now, we may be able to maneuver off and yaw or roll and see stars. Right now, we haven't been able to. The AOT is useless. The command module structure is just radiating too much light into the telescope.
Okay, and how about using the service module to cast a shadow on the commander's window? If you do that, can you see stars for COAS alignment?
We can give that a try, Jack, although I don't know how successful it will be. We try to do it. The light shines off our quads, which makes it difficult to see stars. We do have the Earth and Moon, if that could be of assistance.
Another problem right now, Jack, I'm looking out the right window, and it's pretty dark out that window, but there are about 1,000 or so false stars out here from leftover from some of the debris. It's hard to discern what's real and not real.
Okay, that's good information, and during the time that we see your continuing to pitch, if you ever get in a position where you think the AOT might be of some use, we'd like you to periodically look out of it and see if you can see some stars that would enable us to get a P52.
Okay, will do. And also, let me ask you a question. In this configuration, Doc, we have to use the TTCA to control pitch and roll. And just how much can we use that without really changing our trajectory? We only have 60 miles to play with.
Roger, we'll put that to him.
Okay, Jack, are you ready to go to work with me on the 2-hour depth activation and contingency book page 1?
Roger, we're ready to go.
Okay, item 1, we can, 1 through 5, we can scratch off as done. Is that correct?
Stand by 1, Fred. Okay, Fred, let's go ahead. Step 1, page 1. Everybody's listening.
Okay, I've looked around and I've essentially done steps 1 through 5 with the exception of floodlights and utility lights, and I think we'll just do without those.
Roger, your choice.
Okay, on EPS activation, we're through that bottom of that page. That's all done.
We concur. Page 2.
They're going through their checklist now, I take it, of things to get ready for this
in essence,
burn.
we've circumvented step 4, and we're now sitting with all
seems
4
to be, I gather,
decent maps on
Wally,
high
is
voltage
that,
steps, so I'll
it's
scratch
this matter
off
of
step 4.
of being able to see the stars to get
Roger,
aligned
and in
for this
step 5,
burn that they've
we
now
want to
asked
leave
for.
inverter 1
It's
circuit
sort of a
breaker
mid-course
open.
correction in another hour. Unless they can get lined up, see the stars
Roger,
to
step 5,
properly
we'll
be
leave inverter
aligned,
1
well,
CB
they
open.
can't make the burn,
Omit
can they?
step 6.
Well, this has been our so-called controversy since we've started this business. Everyone but the astronauts keeps telling us that we can see stars in sunlight, and we say we can't, and they're saying the same thing right now. Now, what you normally can do, and that was a suggestion, I think it was sent up by John Young, to try to maneuver the combination of the vehicles so that the LEM visual window or the optical telescope, one or the other or both, were in the shadow of the service module, which would then permit the crew to have dark adaptation to see stars. Well, now there are two problems. One is that the little quads, as you can see my finger touching here, it's not very large, pick up reflected sunlight and still reflect light into that window. The other is this debris that developed from some kind of structural explosion, as we've heard it, from the service module. This debris has drifted around, sort of has created its own atmosphere around the stack. And part of these particles tend to go along with the vehicle. And this is what we've been talking about as the small particles of water vapor and other outgassing forms almost an environment around it. And they look like stars as well. So as a result, you have trouble discerning what is a star and what is a particle. Unless you see motion, of course, the stars don't move, so then you know it's a particle. Well, all of this confuses one when you try to find a star field.
Now, is there no power, no backup battery power in the command module to permit the use of the normal guidance computations, guidance machinery to do this job?
Oh, no, it's all there, but that is in reserve for the re-entry phase. And the ideal way to re-enter, of course, is to have that inertial platform, which is sort of like your attitude reference system, powered up and oriented, I guess is a good way of saying it, Leo, and then so oriented that you can use it for automatic guidance for re-entry. But we have a total backup to that, which we call the EMS, or the Earth Monitoring, entry monitoring system. Right. And this uses an accelerometer, which is not electrically powered in that sense. The entry monitor system requires a scroll to be driven, much like a clockwork mechanism, and a scribe is drawn on it, which the crew can then respond to by acceleration and velocity. And I've flown many of those as a backup mode. We all did, to make a re-entry in case there's a failure with that guidance system in the command module. But to align this whole system from the command module, I think will require too much electrical power from those batteries.
They would not want to go back onto the command service module system because this would drain the batteries, which they cannot recharge if the fuel cells are gone.
No. So all the alignments should be done, and I think they've got time. And this 16 foot per second burn, I appreciated Jim Lovell's remark. He wasn't about to try to do that in 37 minutes, and by no means was he arguing, just was simply stating, look, fellas, let's take more time. So the agreement was to at least wait another hour. Now, as you see, they're going through their checklist. That's another little rule we made back with Apollo 7, was every checklist, every scrap of paper we had on board, an exact duplicate of that was available back in Mission Control Center. The backup crew brought that copy back. So every pen and ink change that was made by the crew on board was documented in another set. So they have a master set, and that's why you can hear them say, we concur with what you have on page 1, let's go to page 2. And you don't have to go through each and every little item on the checklist.
Which is what they're still doing
Yes.
between Houston and the spaceship right now. They're continuing that. When they move on to more understandable matters for us earthbound laymen, why, we'll go back to hearing some of that conversation with the stricken Apollo 13. Meanwhile, out at the Grumman aircraft, Beth Page, Scott McCloud, perhaps can tell us what they will be doing to prepare for and during this burn that is coming up. And I might point out again that the burn we're talking about is a sort of a mid-course correction. Instead of waiting till they get around the moon in another 19 or so hours from now and burning all at once that descent propulsion system engine to put them on the return trajectory to Earth, they will put some of that increased speed in right now in another hour or so, and know it's a kind of a test of the descent propulsion system engine for one thing. They'll know that it's working, that they've got a viable system there, and then they'll put in more of it as they approach the moon or get around the moon. This shows the descent propulsion system engine working in this docked configuration. That's the way it will look when they fire off that engine in another hour or so.
That's interesting that animation's available. That must have been left over from Apollo 9. Am I impressed?
It might be.
That's the only time we've ever tried to do that, of course, in the program, and that's one of the reasons we had the Earth orbital flights of 7 and 9, was to do just this. These contingency plans had to be tested and worked out in Earth orbit before we got committed to the moon, and here we are. We're committed to the moon.
We've got a really experienced bunch of men on the ground in Houston. John Young was the command module pilot for Apollo 10, which is a mission that went to the moon in the dock configuration and did not land. And he's now able to advise on this business of trying to put the service module in between the lunar module and the sun in order to cast a shadow on the windows and give them a chance to see those stars. Let's go out to Scott McCloud at Grumman and now find out from Scott what's going to be taking place in that lunar module in this maneuver.
Walter, I was watching your model there on the little video I have here, and I have the controller that they will use in the vehicle. If you recall, I think Jim mentioned that they would use the TTCA, which is really a translational controller, for pitch and roll control rather than using an attitude controller. If you can see it, this is a translational controller. This is the LEM pilot's translational controller. The commander's, which would probably be used, is behind me, and I don't think you can see it. Let me use my models here. This represents the LEM, if you will, and normally we would use the RCS, the reaction control system, to give us coupled pitch and roll of the LEM. But when they're coupled together, this being your command module, Leo, on top of the LEM now, in order to get roll of the whole coupled spacecraft, if you use the RCS and translation, like I put my pencil, then the whole thing would pivot about the center of gravity of the entire spacecraft, and it would pitch or roll depending on how your thrust was. I think this is one point that possibly wasn't too clear when Jim was mentioning it.
Thank you, Scott. Reviewing the situation again briefly for any late tuners in, Apollo 13 got into trouble tonight. Things were going well up to 10 o'clock tonight, when at that time there was an explosion of some kind. A meteoroid struck perhaps the spacecraft, or an explosion at any rate, and it lost its fuel cells and electrical power, and now it's not going to be able to land on the moon. And we're working out with ground control in Houston the exact maneuvers to bring it back to Earth safely by using the descent propulsion system engine of the lunar module, keeping it with them until they get well on the way back home before jettisoning that now useless lunar module, useless for a moon landing, terribly useful to them right now because it's the batteries in the lunar module which are making it possible for them to survive in space and to have the power to come home. They will be landing, if all the maneuvers go successfully now, back in the Pacific on Friday noon Eastern Standard Time. Let's listen now to an audio tape of the astronauts' initial report of the trouble shortly after 10 o'clock Eastern Time.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
We've had a main B bus undervolt.
Roger, main B undervolt. Okay, stand by, 13. We're looking at it.
Okay, right now, Houston, the voltage is looking good. And we had a pretty large bang associated with the caution and warning there. And as I recall, main B was the one that had a amp spike on it once before.
Roger, Fred.
In the interim here, we're starting to go ahead and button up the tunnel again.
Roger.
That jolt must have rocked the sensor on, see now in O2 quantity 2, it was oscillating down around 20 to 60%. Now it's full scale high again.
Roger.
And Houston, we had a restart on our computer. We had pink light and the restart reset.
Roger, restart and a pings light. Restart on a ping and reset.
And I'm looking at our service module RTS helium 1. We have B as barber pole and D as barber pole. Helium 2, D as barber pole. And secondary propellants, I have A and C barber pole. T-Mac.
Wally, that's the first time you've heard that
That is.
exchange.
That wasn't very happy in my book. I'd say that they had some problems. I was quite interested to hear the fact that they inferred they had almost an explosion. It was quite evident in this thing, and it seemed to be just bandied about in that press conference. They did note an attitude change. They noted some caution warning lights come on. These all
mentioned the loud bang, which
yes.
is very interesting.
That is, because to hear that noise come through the structure means that something did happen back there. There's obviously an explosion. There's no doubt in my mind about it now.
They also, just shortly after that, reported that they were venting oxygen, and then this debris matter came up.
Yes.
So clearly something of major nature happened there.
No doubt.
Explosion, or as was suggested in the news conference, the possibility that they were hit by a meteoroid. The Space Agency officer Bob McMurray, describing the activity early today in the homes of Apollo 13 astronauts Jim Lovell and Fred Hayes, said the atmosphere is tense. Everyone's listening to the squawk box and watching television. Squawk box, of course, the little public address amplifier that is brought into the homes of the astronauts when they're on a mission, and we can imagine that things are tense, although we will repeat what Christopher Kraft said at the news conference. Excuse me. He said that while this is as serious as any problem we've ever had in space, their situation is safe at the moment, and chances are excellent of a safe recovery if the lunar module continues to work well. They are depending on the lunar module now for the battery power to fire its engines to get them out of a lunar orbit and back on the way home once they get up that far. Well, they actually wouldn't go into a lunar orbit now. They're not on that sort of trajectory. They would go in a looping orbit around the partial orbit around the moon, and then back onto a path that would take them between the moon and the Earth. I forget that figure, but 20,000 miles or so. They've missed the Earth by on that trajectory, I believe.
I think it's 50,000 miles.
50,000 miles.
It's a fair piece.
It's a long way. It's
right.
Certainly not that 150 miles or so from which they could drop out of Earth orbit back safely. But what they're doing is depending on that lunar module to fire off the descent propulsion system engine to put them back on a safe return trajectory to the Earth. and also they're depending on the lunar module for its oxygen supply to sustain them until they get back on their way back home when they go back on the command module's oxygen supply for reentry. The present plan is for them to make the first firing of that engine about 45 minutes from now for the first initial speed up, just about 16 feet per second, and that's not a great deal, but kind of a mid-course correction is what it amounts to, and then a later burn tomorrow night when they get to the edge of the moon, which will speed them up further to assure this trajectory home. They return, if all goes well, as we have said, would be at 12:13 p.m. Eastern Standard Time in the Pacific. That's 142 hours elapsed time since they left from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida in that beautiful takeoff at 2:13 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Saturday. If by any chance it's needed to bring them home a little earlier, they will bring them down in the Atlantic and save 9 hours of their consumables. Let's look now at a videotape of a television transmission that the astronauts sent back to Earth just moments before the trouble began this evening.
And now while Fred's taking his hammering down and restarting it, I might give you some idea of the sort of confusion of attitude since there is no up or down, and I'm situated on top of the ascent engine just at the entrance to the tunnel. I'll reverse the camera 180 degrees and go from Fred, look through the tunnel again back at Odyssey, and we might pick up part of Jack.
There he is. We see him.
That's Jim Lovell now pointing the camera at Jack Swigert in Odyssey. We're at 55 hours 38 minutes into the flight of Apollo 13.
Houston, for the benefit of the television viewers, we've just about completed our little inspection of Aquarius, and now we're proceeding through the hatch again and through the tunnel and going back down the Odyssey.
Okay, Jim, it's been a great show so far.
It's Apollo Control, Houston, 55 hours, 39 minutes now into the flight. We presently show Odyssey and Aquarius at an altitude of 175,552 nautical miles, now traveling at a speed of 3,171 feet per second. Although we copied no voice confirmation as to exactly when Spacecraft Commander Jim Lovell first went inside Aquarius, the flight plan called for an ingress time of 54 hours of 3 minutes, and we assume that this occurred around that time.
And finally out, Jack's moving back into the Odyssey as we slide on through the tunnel here. 13, are you still on TV?
Yeah, we sure are. We got a good picture of the skipper there.
Okay, well, we can show you now a little added benefit. We've got the drogue on Fred's couch in the command module.
Just shortly after that transmission, that television transmission earlier tonight, just within minutes, they began to leave the lunar module, in which Jim Lovell and Fred Hayes were checking out the systems. Believed that at that time they were checking them out preparatory to their landing on the moon on Wednesday. They re-entered the command module, and they were just beginning to button up the hatch to seal off the lunar module again when this explosion or meteoroid impact, whatever it was, took place that knocked out the electrical system of the command module, the service propulsion system primarily, and caused this change of plans. An abort of the moon mission, a cancellation of that, and now the serious matter of reorienting the flight and bringing it back home safely with the use of the lunar module's descent propulsion system engines. We pause now 5 seconds for station identification. Apollo 13 is now 215,000 miles from Earth. It's moving at 2,100 miles per hour toward the moon, and the busy astronauts, Jim Lovell, Fred Hayes, and Jack Swigert, are preparing to burn the descent propulsion system engine of the lunar module, still attached, fortunately, to the command module and the service propulsion, or the service module, to begin to speed them up, to change their course just a bit so that they will swing around the moon and safely return to Earth, scheduled for Friday. They have been up now just 2.5 days since their launch from Cape Kennedy on last Saturday. It seems interesting that Jim Lovell named the command module Odyssey after the great book of Homer's, describing the 10 years of trials and tribulations in the voyage of Odysseus. Well, they're having trials and tribulations, indeed, in this Odyssey, but like Homer's hero, they are expected to return home safely. Excuse me. Meanwhile, in Houston, of course, the atmosphere has been described as tense, but as is true of the space community at a time like this when matters are serious, they all gather together, and we're told that at the home of Jim Lovell, where they have 4 children, 3 of them are at home. James III is in St. James, Wisconsin, we're told. Their home, their family home is up that way in Milwaukee. With Mrs. Lovell are astronauts Pete Conrad and his wife, Robert Thompson, a top space agency official, their pastor of the LaPorte Episcopal Church, Reverend Donald Raish. The Conrads and the minister have been invited to the house as dinner guests before this crisis arose tonight, and they've been staying on. Astronaut Alan Bean arrived at the Hayes home shortly after the trouble developed. Mrs. Hayes is expecting their 4th child in June. They have 3 children at home. They've been watching on television and listening to the voice of mission control as brought to them by private transmitters, private receiving sets in their homes. The crew of Apollo 13 now is continuing to disconnect all those electrical and mechanical devices they normally would use to operate in lunar orbit. Various components of the guidance system are being turned off with the hope that such action will save more electrical power and aid that safe return home. Lovell's been told that he can turn off the heaters that normally protect the rendezvous and landing radars from the frigid temperatures of space. Those 2 devices, since they won't be landing on the moon, aren't going to be needed any longer either. I wonder, it's a little early, I think, gentlemen, Leo Krupp from North American Rockwell, and Wally Schirra, it's a little early to talk about the future of the space program, but I think that it must be in everybody's minds at this moment. It was mentioned at the news conference that this has got to have some effect. They certainly are going to want to know what went wrong before they launch Apollo 14. They check out these things first, and that could be a long process, couldn't it?
Well, it's understandable that troubleshooting, as we call it in the trade, has to be completed. The story must be analyzed, and it should never happen again. In this case, there's some rather sketchy information, I'd say. We really don't know yet, and I don't think anyone's really trying to trace back in that sense to see what happened. They're trying to figure out what to do from here on.
Well, now, they're not going to get the service module back, quite clearly. It has to be jettisoned in space before the re-entry. How are they going to analyze what happened out there?
Well, Walter, a lot of the information from the service module comes down to the ground on telemetry, so there will be an analysis of all the data. And from this, the experts may be able to piece together and determine the probabilities of what happened. And let's hope that they can. And in a program of this magnitude, I think we all expect that we will have problems sooner or later, and of one nature or another. We just hope that they aren't serious. And I think everybody should be aware of the fact that the condition we're in right now is an emergency condition. However, there is nothing time critical at the present time. The crew is operating in a normal manner. They're very calm. They're going about the troubleshooting and setting up the spacecraft like good trained astronauts and test pilots would do in an emergency. And all the experts of NASA back at Houston are giving them all the support from the ground that they possibly can. And there's really nothing time critical about the situation we're in. We have an emergency, but it's being handled in a very orderly and theoretical manner. And I'm sure that the people at Houston are going to be able to analyze this and get these people back.
If they come to the conclusion that this has been a meteoroid impact that caused this, what would you say the effect of this would be on future manned space travel? I recall in very early news conferences when we were first talking of going to space, when we were back in the Vanguard days and we're just beginning to think about the Redstone Mercury flights, the suborbital, we asked that question, and the experts all said, oh, it's 1,000,000 to 1 or more shot that this could happen, a meteoroid impact. But if they determine it is, why, I suppose you could say, well, that's the 1,000,000 to 1. It happened on our 23rd manned space flight, so we've now got 999,976 more flights to go before we're hit by another one. But
no, unfortunately, it doesn't work.
No.
Statistically, you can prove almost anything you want to prove. I don't think we'll ever prove that it was a meteoroid, in that we can't recover the service module. You made note of that yourself. This will burn up in the atmosphere on re-entry from the lunar return. The hope is, of course, to check all this telemetry, which is the radio signal term that has all the data sent back to the Earth. Now, this data comes in various forms. Some of it's what we call high-speed data, meaning every little squiggle indicates a pressure-sensitive measurement. These can all be interpreted, but it takes a long time to do it, and we'll have time, of course, to interpret this data. And with that, we may see a trace that would indicate that a particular line may have ruptured, or a pressure vessel may have ruptured, in turn had a sympathetic explosion. And I don't like to say a major cataclysmic explosion, but one that would cause another tank to go. And this is what we mean by sympathetic. So these things could happen. But this data is available. That's why we still call these test flights. That data keeps coming in.
we're going back to Mission Control now and to a report from our network correspondent who has been at Mission Control all evening, Roy Neal.
It's now well after 2 o'clock in the morning here in Houston, and the faces in Mission Control are beginning to look a little drawn and gray. For more than 3 hours, these men have been under the tremendous pressure of trying to put Apollo 13 back together again, of figuring out what to do to bring it home. At the moment in Mission Control, up on the executive row of consoles, Dr. Robert Gilruth, the center director, and Christopher Kraft, his right-hand man, are sitting. They're accompanied by some of the top officials, Dale Meyer, Director of Manned Spaceflight from NASA headquarters, and others. The center of activity is the flight director's position, where at the moment Glyn Lunny and two other flight directors, Jerry Griffin and Milton Windler, are running the operation, checking all points to see what can be done to best advantage to correct situations as they develop. And up on Astronauts Row at the capsule communicator's position, Jack Lausma is the voice that we hear, but he's surrounded by Donald K. Slayton, Director of the Astronauts Office, astronaut John Young, Tom Stafford, Associate Director of that office, and others who have been moving into and out of the room through the night. At all console positions, we see 2 and 3 men respectively, and it's been this way all evening. All hands showed up as if by magic shortly after the trouble developed, and ever since the problem has been one of what can they do? Still working out the problems, and now just about 30 minutes away from a burn that will put the spacecraft on a free return trajectory, one that would bring it home under any circumstances. Roy Neal in Mission Control.
So that critical burn comes just about a half hour from now, and I suppose they're pretty busy in that lunar module getting ready for that, aren't they, Wally? But actually, it doesn't have to come at that second. I mean, if they ask for more time, they could have it. They've got 20 hours or
there are all sorts of variables. The landing point, there's no reason, for example, if it became critical that they couldn't land on land if they had to, if this were the requirement. I think the first thing that has to be determined is whether they can align the spacecraft properly and to Jim Lovell's satisfaction that he is exactly lined and that he is not going to make a burn that's going to send him the wrong way. There's no game being played, of course, and the ground, of course, concurs with that. So that can vary up and down all over. What they've done with this 3:42, 43 Eastern Time burn, that is the time that they negotiated in the last discussion. We'll see if Jim can get his stack, his whole vehicle aligned properly, and he's satisfied he is. I'm sure he'll go ahead and do it.
It seems incredible when we're talking about moving at speeds of 2,100 miles an hour and so forth out there, and they get up to a speed, of course, of 25,000 miles an hour to get on the way to the moon. It's been slowing down ever since as the Earth drags them back. They would be speeding up shortly as they got into the moon's gravitational pull again. But when we talk about all of those high speeds, that we're now talking about a change in velocity of just 14.5 miles an hour. It makes all the difference in whether these men come home safely or don't. It's that little change makes the difference. I wish we had a blackboard here so we could draw that out for you. Trying to do it in space. Here's the moon, and they're on the way out to the moon like this. And if they didn't fire the rockets, they would go around the moon, and come whipping back this way toward Earth, but miss it by that 50,000 miles. Now then, by speeding up, they defy the Earth's orbital pull, the moon's orbital pull. Instead of pulling them back down so they swing out that way, they're able to come out a little closer and come back to Earth. You can follow that thing. This doesn't really quite show up, but it gives you a rough idea. They're on the way out here. This thing occurred about out at this point somewhere. Well, if they kept on the trajectory that they were on, they would have gone around the moon, and if not firing any more engines, they would come around the moon and go swinging, being caught by the moon's gravity, swung out here and go on shooting out this way. In other words, missing Earth by 50,000 miles, and then they'd be in a high Earth orbit and not come back in time for safe recovery. But by firing that engine, speeding up, they defy the moon's gravity and swing around here and come back toward Earth and a safe landing. That's the maneuver that they're about to perform. It's due at 3:42 Eastern Standard Time, and that's about 25 minutes from now. The moon mission itself has been scrubbed, the moon landing. The reason for that is without enough electrical power, they can't fire the big service propulsion system engine. That's a 20,500-pound thrust engine that would normally be used to bring them home. Since they cannot fire that engine, they can only get home now by using the lunar landing engine. And since they need it to get home, they quite obviously can't use it to go down to the moon, because that part of the lunar module is left on the moon's surface so that the two men who go to the moon can get back to the command module in the first place. The simulations right now being conducted by the backup crew at the Manned Spacecraft Center have so far produced, we're told, one important result. The Apollo 13 crew can use the lunar module's primary guidance system to control the spacecraft's attitude. Lovell's been having some small difficulty in holding that the docked spaceship from rolling around, as you know, but apparently they've figured out in the simulator how he can correct that problem and are sending the information up to him. Bruce Morton has more for us right now from the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston.
Walter, you were talking a moment ago about the burn that's coming up in 25 minutes from now. One of our CBS News people here was talking to Sig Sjoberg, the mission director, after the news conference, and he pointed out that this is a burn they really don't have to make. It's a choice. NASA wanted to get back on a free return trajectory as quickly as possible. They could have delayed this burn or not done it at all and simply relied on one big trans-Earth injection burn, probably on the dark side of the moon. They obviously preferred to do it this way. This way they'll know within an hour or so that at least they are on a free return trajectory. This doesn't commit them yet to deciding where to try to bring the spacecraft down. They don't have to make that decision. The Atlantic, which means a night landing in an area where there are not ships deployed, or a Pacific landing, which means a longer trip in space for the astronauts. They don't need to make that decision until they finally do come to the TEI burn, the trans-Earth injection burn, which is due what is now this evening at probably around 9:30 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. The simulations are continuing, and there's some hope here now. Jim Lovell had spoken earlier of difficulty in seeing out the windows because of debris. It was then suggested that he could probably see out of the optical device, the telescope. That may not be covered. We've been looking at diagrams here, and at least it sticks out from the LEM at a slightly different angle from the windows. There's some hope that he would be able to get a reasonably good star sighting through that. Mission control, as Roy Neal said a moment ago, is just jammed with people. I think almost every astronaut who's down here at the Manned Spacecraft Center has been in at one time or another tonight, with a couple of exceptions who've been staying with Mrs. Hayes and Mrs. Lovell, both of whom we're told are disappointed that the moon landing isn't going to come off, but taking all the rest of the alarm and the worry tonight just extremely well. Walter?
Thank you, Bruce Morton, at the Manned Space Center in Houston, from which we've been getting regular reports throughout these last 5.5 hours since we first learned that the flight of Apollo 13 was in considerable trouble. But let us repeat again the words of the spacecraft Space Center officials down there, that while this problem is as serious as they've ever had, the men are safe at the moment, and chances are excellent for their safe return to Earth. This has been a long 5.5 hours, and now we're going to get in the next, within the next 20 minutes, just about 20 minutes from now, the word on the proper alignment of the spacecraft and the firing of the descent propulsion system engine to speed up the spacecraft by 15 miles an hour, 14.5 to be precise, which will put them on this so-called free return trajectory. In other words, which will assure that they'll go whipping around the moon and come home. The orbital physical laws are such that that must happen if they're on the proper course and they get the proper burn. They may want to make some mid-course corrections on the way home, but that should do the job. We've learned again tonight that even though we have been sending men into space for almost a decade now, space flight is still a very dangerous business. Before the flight, David Shoemaker asked Jim Lovell and Fred Hayes how they viewed the risk of Apollo 13.
Maybe we become complacent about space flight, but the risks are there. Anytime you put 3 people on top of 6 million pounds of high explosive and send them 25,000 miles an hour into space, 240,000 miles away to land on some body that hasn't got an atmosphere and 1.6G and a pressure suit that is that thin, and you're taking risks. I think it's a tribute to our American engineering that we can do this, and we can do this with what appears to be apparent ease. But this complacency that people have because we do it so easily, I think sort of masks the tremendous amount of efforts that are done to make sure that we accomplish what we want to do safely.
I'd say it's like most of the airplane testing business. I've been more concerned about the fact I maybe wouldn't get the job done right. I'd be able to carry out the plan and meet the objectives.
Jim Lovell is our most experienced man in space, the world's most experienced man in space. He's a 42-year-old Navy captain, a graduate of Annapolis. This is his 4th flight, and he is the first man to ever make 2 flights to the moon. He was with Frank Borman on the Gemini 7 flight that set a new space endurance record back in December of '65, 14 days. He was the commander of the Gemini 12 flight in November of 1966, in which Ed Aldrin made the longest spacewalks we had made up to that time, and in which they flew tethered flight. They connected their spaceship with a target vehicle, an Agena target vehicle, and that was quite a feat at the time. And then he was the command module pilot on the Apollo 8 that went around the moon, first men to the moon in December of '68. And it's interesting that he was a substitute on that crew for Mike Collins, who was unable to make that flight, but made a later one to the moon, as we know. But he did. Lovell did make it. And altogether, with all of that, he accumulated 572 hours in space, a total of 23 days and 20 hours. And that's more than any other man has ever accumulated in space. This trip, if it had been a full 10-day mission, would have brought him to 33 days in space. And as it goes, just a 7-day mission, he'll just about eke out a full month in space of a 30-day month with the mission as it is now scheduled. Jim Lovell was born in Cleveland, and he was raised in Milwaukee. He has 4 children, Barbara 16, Jay 15, Susan 11, and Jeffrey, who is just 4. The other 2 members of his crew are space rookies. They have never made flights before. His command module, or lunar module pilot, the man with whom he intended to walk on the moon, is a 36-year-old civilian, Fred Hayes, from Biloxi, Mississippi. But Hayes formerly did have service in the armed services. As a matter of fact, he flew for the Navy, the Marines, the Air Force, and the Air National Guard, and before he became a NASA test pilot. He started out in life to be a newspaper man, but he got shifted over when he found that the only way he could get a commission during the Korean War was to get a Navy pilot's commission. So he did that, and he found flying, loved it, and left the Biloxi Daily Herald to become an astronaut eventually. He didn't know it at the time. At that time, he had only a junior college education, but later on he went to the University of Oklahoma and got an engineering degree while he was in the Navy. He was a backup pilot for Apollos 8 and 11, and he's got 3 children, Stephen 8, Frederick 11, and Mary 14. Jack Swigert, as we all know, is the man who took over when German measles managed to circulate around among the astronauts, and Ken Mattingly, who was scheduled to be the command module pilot, was found to be susceptible to them. Although he hasn't come down with them yet, they pulled him off the flight and put Jack Swigert in his stead. Swigert is a skilled pilot. He's got more jet hours, I think, than almost any of the active astronauts, and he's got more simulator time than most of them, according to Wally Schirra, who says he was a real simulator hound, grabbed the hours on the simulators whenever he could, which is a good thing. He literally did write the book on the command module and its possible malfunctions. He's a bachelor, 38 years old. His parents are Dr. and Mrs. Swigert of Denver, Colorado. Dr. Swigert is an ophthalmologist, an eye doctor. Jack Swigert is also a civilian, although he had 3 years in the Air Force. He went to the University of Colorado, where he got a Master of Science degree, and then went on to Rensselaer Polytechnic, and of all things, got a Master of Business Administration at the University of Hartford. Still not explained satisfactorily to the biography writers at NASA, apparently. He was an engineering test pilot out there with you, Leo, at North American.
Yes, sir.
I gather all the people out of Downey, California are mighty proud that their boy is on the way to the moon here, although he won't get that orbiting of the moon that had been planned. He was the man who would have been left behind in the command module while Lovell and Hayes went down to the moon's surface. The coolness evident in the voices of the 3 astronauts throughout this operation, which you have remarked on, well, both of you have remarked on, that they are cool, they're test pilots, they're doing their job out there, but to us laymen, it has been quite remarkable. They've maintained a sense of humor, too, that I think we Earthlings most likely could not under these circumstances. Just moments ago, Capcom Jack Lausma asked Fred Hayes, how do you like this sim? Referring to the simulations that there's all that Hayes' experience has been so far, and the astronauts run through to prepare for emergencies. And Hayes replied, it's a beauty. I guess it is.
Well, this is part of our breeding, I guess, as pilots. We've gone through all sorts of various emergencies, real emergencies in aircraft, and you find this group averages in ages from 30 to, when I last flew, at least 45. And we faced a lot of different experiences, so it's not a newfound thing. And if you find us arguing with people who say, well, I can get in there because I can fly a Piper Cub, obviously I'm as good a pilot as you are, and I'm a scientist too, you better let me get in there. I think maybe we're teaching a few people a lesson about reality at last. And it's part of what we've been arguing about for a long time.
As a matter of fact, we have had some demonstrations of this before. We had it on Gemini 6 when you had that early engine shutdown on the pad, which is about as close a thing to disaster as you can get. And your reactions after thousands of simulations of all the various possibilities, perhaps not that very specific one, but you reacted properly, and instead of ejecting and letting the tower blow you off of there, why we don't have a tower in Gemini.
No,
instead of ejecting,
seat in this
why
case,
you
right. Mm-hmm.
you flip the right buttons, analyze the problem in a split second, and settle back on the pad. You're all right, saved a mission. Was it Neil Armstrong in
sure.
Gemini 8 when the tumbling began, analyzing their problem, damping out the tumbling, and managing to make a safe re-entry. These problems, we've had some close ones before.
Well, we're still feeling our way along. The mission to the moon is almost a brute force mission. We've had all sorts of redundant paths. We've carried extra equipment, and we were trimming back a little bit, and we saw this success, and as Jim Lovell made note of, he detected the complacency, and you and I saw it in Apollo 12. We started talking about apathy. Of course, recall that day, 3 men really went to work in a hurry.
Yeah,
when that lightning hit that beauty, and that word beauty is about the way we do talk. It took 6 hands moving in rapid areas in the right direction to salvage that mission. And that's just what you're seeing right now. In this case, time is not of the essence. In Gemini 6, it was time. It was microseconds. In Gemini 8, there were very few seconds. And in Apollo 12, again, it was back to microseconds. They had a choice of aborting right then and there or deciding that the vehicle could go on. Now, here we have lots of time. In fact, we're going to have anguishing hours as we see each one of these steps met and passed. And this in a way, is fortunate because they can sit back and diagnose every path. And as you've detected and told everyone, we are simulating every facet of this mission right now to be sure each step that's followed in the future will work properly.
You know, it's interesting that you should say those words, because almost the same words just came over the ticker here, quoting Neil Armstrong and Alan Bean as saying that they said this electrical failure in Apollo 13 happened at a very good time if it had to happen. Their consensus is that it gives the astronauts time to research the problem, do something about it, as opposed to another part of the mission when they wouldn't have the time available to them. And I see you, Leo, Rupp and Wally, both of you shaking your heads in agreement with that.
I hope you realize that Leo is one of that same club, and that little lapel pin he's wearing is one we're all very proud of, and that is our emblem of the Society of Experimental Test Pilots, and this is why we argue our cause so vociferously.
And with good reason, certainly. I've just been advised by CBS News correspondent Ike Pappas out in Denver that at the Swigert home there, the astronauts' parents, according to Tom Andrews of NASA, who's with them, are, of course, very much concerned over the situation. However, they are optimistic about the safe return of the astronauts, as the space people are in Houston themselves. They feel that all will go well from here on out, that the men will be brought back safely. According to Andrews, Mrs. Swigert has expressed her optimism, saying she has great confidence in what is being done to make sure the men will get back safely. I think we reported that to you a little earlier this evening. Dr. Swigert is resting at this hour this morning. He hasn't been too well. For that reason, Dr. and Mrs. Swigert did not go down to see the launch in that last hasty 24 hours they had after they found out that their son was going on this mission. They were surprised to learn he was, as indeed he was, so surprised he forgot to file his income tax return before he left.
I found out Jack, by the way, was one of the last to get suited up, or at least he was rushing. He was still brushing his teeth when they were mustering the crew to get their suits put on. So he was dragging all along, not dragging in the sense of not wanting to go, but just trying to keep up.
I think he forgot to take some part of his flight plan along with him, the card on which they'd marked some of the things to read into the computer or something, and they had to read them back up to it.
Oh, great.
But that must have been pretty hectic. Good golly, to suddenly find you're going to the moon when you thought you were going to be lucky to get a ride 3 years hence, perhaps, to the moon. 2 years or so. We're going back to Houston now to hear another report from our network correspondent who has been in the mission control, Roy Neal.
Attitude of the spacecraft looks good. Also, the computer experts say that in their opinion, right now, the burn looks good. Control a moment ago responded to the flight director by saying that they would like to make a couple of last-minute checks. Those are now being talked out, one of which was that they'd like to put the throttle to manual control and get off of autopilot. This is the kind of check going on now, as Glyn Lunny confirms with all points that Apollo 13 is indeed ready to burn, ready to go. These checks will continue up till the last minute, at which time we'll hear the capsule communicator talking them down to the split second as they burn into a free return, which should bring them to not closer than 136.5 miles from the surface of the moon. Roy Neal in Mission Control.
That burn is scheduled for 3:42 and 43 seconds a.m. Eastern Time, and it is 3:36 Eastern Standard Time, so we have about 6 minutes and 15 seconds. Let's listen now to the astronauts as they talk to Mission Control for a moment.
We're on these stages now.
Aquarius, delete the board stage circuit breaker close. Leave it open.
Roger, we'll delete. Okay, also, Jackson, we have 4 jet haulage versus 2. Do you want still want 10 seconds haulage, or you want 5 now?
Okay, Aquarius, we'll use automatic haulage.
Okay, we'll just let the 7.5 seconds auto haulage do it.
Roger, and we'd like to do this in manual throttle. So on page 17, about 2/3 of the way down, throttle control, manual, vice, auto.
Okay, we're set to manual.
What's the 203 question?
Enter on the 203, Jim.
We got 203 in the Nisky now. What's that required for? Can we pass it?
Aquarius, enter on the 203.
We have entered.
Aquarius, we'd like to verify that your throttle is in the min position.
That's affirmed.
And in the event that you have to do a manual takeover, turn the engine gimbal off, mode control to attitude hold, and use the TTCA.
Roger.
This is Houston, confirming with the men in Apollo 13 that they are following all of the prescribed flight plan for this firing of the descent propulsion system engine, now just 3.5 minutes away.
30 to burn.
Roger.
Okay, master arms on, 1 minute.
Roger, Aquarius, and you go for the burn.
So everything is in readiness for this critical maneuver. That descent propulsion system engine is throttleable. That is, it can be operated from 1,050 pounds thrust to 9,500 pounds thrust. They really don't need much of a burn at this point, just enough to increase their speed 14.5 miles an hour, and that will give them the speed to be put back on a so-called free return trajectory that will assure that they will go skimming around the moon and be headed back safely toward Earth.
40%.
We're waiting.
Okay, Aquarius, you're looking good.
Waiting to hear from that burn due in about a minute and a half from now.
Auto shutdown.
Means they made the burn. Does this sound like you do? I heard Apollo shutdown.
Okay, you're looking at 1685 now, Jack.
It's due just now.
Okay, you're going to residuals. Proceed.
No, it's due
Yeah.
another.
They made the burn. The residuals are the little decimal errors they're going to burn out.
Okay, when you say go on the residuals, you mean don't trim them, is that right?
That's affirmative. No trim required.
Hmm. The burn's complete. The slight errors that were left were not enough to take out. It was interesting to note that he said Apollo shutdown. He hasn't been talking Odyssey just now. I guess he's not sure which one he's really working. Of course, he is. He knows he's in Aquarius. But that first statement, Apollo shutdown, meant that the burn had been completed, and the slight burn that were off the desired velocity were not sufficient to trim out with the reaction control engines, the attitude engines. So apparently we have completed this tweak burn.
How will we get confirmation?
Aquarius, check your master arm off, please.
How will we get confirmation that the trajectory, the attitude was right for this burn?
They'll be tracking him from the ground, Walter, and they should have a ground track on him here and be able to update his trajectory.
This will take time, and we have time. So the trajectory itself is... Actually, the navigation is kept on the ground if you really get down there.
Okay, Houston, burn's complete. Now we have to talk about power down and what do you want us to do with the thing?
Roger, we're looking at that right now, and you'll be the first one to get to work.
What he's talking about is the primary guidance navigation system, whether they will in turn power that down. Apparently the reference system is good enough for that burn. It went off well. Unless they can find stars and update its attitude reference system, they'll stick with what they've got and not power it now.
And Houston, it's doubtful right now whether we'll be able to see the stars in this configuration. The only way we could possibly get alignment is with the Earth and the terminator, or the Moon and its terminator. And I'd sure like to have you look at the power down, keeping the pings if at all possible.
Roger, Jim, we'll get the word for you.
Now, looking at that simulation, you can imagine the far side of it would be dark, and that's what they're hoping would be the way he could look at stars.
Standing up in mission control for just a little stretch, I guess. The tension of the last 5.5 hours beginning to show. They're stretching out. They've got that burn out of the way. They, assuming that the trajectory is good now, the men are on the way home. In essence, they're still on the way out to the moon, but the speed should be up if the course is correct. They'll whip around the moon tomorrow night,
It's just about
coming home.
It's like the baseball game that started now. You can't go from first to third to home. You're going to go by second, and that's about where the moon is. And this is the pattern that applies to orbital mechanics as well as the stadium mechanics, I guess.
We might point out again why they didn't just turn around and come home. Well, it's not quite that simple. It takes a lot of power to stop the flight path that they were on and to abort in mid space in that fashion. They don't have that power. That's just the trouble. With the service propulsion system engine out, they had to go on the way.
That's right. If the service propulsion system had been active,
Houston,
that would have been possible.
Can we turn off the button?
With that engine out, the only way to get back was to take the free return trip around the moon.
And that's what they're now doing.
Stand by on that one, Jim.
Ken Mattingly was scheduled to go on this flight, then had the problem with the German measles. Has been in mission control all evening up to just a short while ago. When he left there, it's believed that he's on the way to the simulator to work with the backup crew for Apollo 13, where they're working out all of these various problems. To be able to tell the men up there in Apollo 13, give us some advice and suggestions on how to handle the future maneuvers and problems.
It's kind of interesting, I think, to make note of these simulators. We have a lot of money invested in those, and I think they're paying off rather rapidly now in real time. All the crews have spent hundreds and hundreds of hours in them. There's one working in Houston, and there's one, of course, working at the Cape. Either one will do the job, and they can actually be pumped right into a mission control center. Now, they obviously wouldn't be pumped into this one, I mean fed into it as a real spacecraft, but you can use another mission control center. There are actually 2 other rooms available, so that this can all be simulated the whole flight.
Speaking of the expensive simulators, the cost of this mission was estimated around $375 million. So while the concern is, of course, of getting the astronauts home safely, nobody's thinking about dollars and cents. It is a $375 million loss to us since the objectives of the mission have not been accomplished, will not be accomplished, but there'll be no moon landing. And that means a considerable re-examination of the future moon landing programs, assuming that there are no fundamental hardware problems. There don't seem to be. We've flown a lot of Apollos quite successfully up to now, assuming that they decide that the meteoroid strike, if that's what it was a very rare chance, and we don't need to do anything about that, and I don't know what you do, except perhaps strengthen the structure, and if you did that, you're adding a lot of weight, and we'd have to go back to the old drawing board again, wouldn't we? But at any rate, no matter what they do about those things, they're going to have to look now at the scientific aspect of the program. Do they now recast the missions that Apollo 14, 15, 16, 17 were going to go on? Do they want to recast another mission for this Fra Mauro area, which is supposed to be perhaps one of the oldest on the moon as far as exposed rock goes, and was of tremendous interest to the scientists? Or will they go ahead and do other things? I guess there's no way to even speculate on that tonight. It'll take a considerable examination after they decide the mechanical problems.
Well, these are the techniques that we look at with each flight when you think of it. For example, imagine this having happened if we had Apollo 11 on the way to the moon, and it could just as well have happened. And this is why we had as many Apollo spacecraft lined up to do the mission, in case any one of the minor events might have added up. For example, on this particular flight, where one of the engines shut down prematurely on the second stage. This, if it had shut down earlier, might have caused the vehicle only to go into Earth orbit, not even leave to the moon. So the what-ifs are finally coming along. And the what-ifs meaning, what if this happened? Well, in this case, what if 2 fuel cells fail? Well, we've looked at those kind of contingencies, and now we're finding a new way of playing the what-if game. And I agree, we'll have to sit back and regroup a little bit and see where we're going from here.
You know, It would be really remarkable, of course, if it was a meteoroid strike. But in a way, I suppose, standpoint of our space program generally, we'd take a certain comfort in knowing that that's what happened, because really it is remarkable that in this entire Apollo program we have had no major malfunctions of equipment. And this has been quite a remarkable story for that reason.
I can recall, in fact, it was way back in testing days, and maybe you can help me on this, Leo, but it seemed that we had I think it was a helium bottle, fail in one of the booster stages. Wasn't the S-4B out on the West Coast somewhere?
Yeah.
And it blew out a portion of it, and this was fairly cataclysmic. It really tore the devil out of that one particular stage. So I find it difficult, frankly, to think of some bottle back there blowing, because it's kind of messy, at least.
Well,
So,
I don't think anyone at this point in time can really offer much of an explanation. I think after the NASA people have a chance to analyze the data, they can probably come up with some indications, because they're looking at so many parameters, pressure, temperatures, and volumes, and everything else, that if a system did get out of control that caused a problem in the system, I'm sure we'll know it. And but I think at this time it's just plain guesswork on everybody's part until they get a chance to look at the data.
There's one thing about it in discussing the whatever the problem was, whatever the failure was, it was a mission that failed, and we've gone beyond the point when I think NASA can kind of explain these things away and say, well, we've learned something this way anyway as part of the test program. I mean, we expect things to go wrong in testing out, which was the explanation when we saw boosters go tumbling down the Atlantic range and have to be exploded early, and the long delays in getting off the ground because of problems that we had to correct in the early days of manned flight. We really have gone beyond that stage, and this, therefore, is a lot more serious problem than we've had in the past. It cannot be explained away that way.
Well, the key to our attitude on any of the flights, I think, is the fact that it's based on confidence. And, of course, to get the crew's confidence back, the next crew's confidence back, at least for this type of voyage, a lot of data has to be brought out. And that, I think, is the point Leo's making. We do have a lot of data. That particular case with Gemini 6 had its problem, where the booster shut down prematurely. We had, I'd say, probably a half a mile of data that we reduced, and found out one other thing was wrong. There was a dust plug-in. If that event hadn't happened, something else would have happened shortly after that. So this is why we have a lot of our payload involved with literally broadcasting back the pressures, the temperatures, the sources of information that indicate what and what might go wrong. This is why we have to do that. And it takes a lot of payload capability away from us. This is why I'm not saying that, why I refuse to say that we're going to send the population of the Earth to another planet one of these days.
Well, we ought to recount perhaps at this hour just what has transpired tonight. Apollo 13 had something rather cataclysmic happen at around 10 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, 6 hours ago. Perhaps a meteoroid hit it. That's one phase of the speculation. Perhaps one of the many high-pressure bottled tanks aboard the service module exploded. At any rate, suddenly there was an explosion, a bang, as the fellows reported aboard Apollo 13. Oxygen was vented shortly thereafter, and the fuel cells went out. The all-important cells which provide electrical energy for the command module and for the big service propulsion system engine, which is normally used to boost the spacecraft back into an Earth trajectory for the safe return from the moon. Without that electrical power, that engine was useless, and therefore some alternate arrangements had to be made to bring the men home safely. The alternate arrangements involved the use of the descent propulsion system engine on the lunar module. To use that to bring them safely back from the moon means it cannot be used to place men on the moon, so the moon landing portion of the Apollo 13 mission, which was, of course, its prime purpose, had to be canceled, scrubbed, forgotten. Instead, all the men at Mission Control in Houston, as the wives of the astronauts and parents anxiously waited word, began working on how to get them back safely. That involved the use of the descent propulsion system engine, and it has just 15 minutes ago been fired, and as far as we know, the spacecraft is on the proper trajectory and now at the proper speed to make a half circle of the moon and start safely home tomorrow night for a splashdown in the Pacific at 12:13 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Friday. The situation is serious, according to Mission Control in Houston, and the most serious they've ever had in space, but the men are in a safe position right now, and Houston has every confidence they will get home safely. We pause now 5 seconds for station identification. Just reading a report up from the Manned Space Center. On the advice of Mission Control, Fred Hayes has been told to turn off the transmitter and the receiver in Aquarius, the lunar landing module. There will be no communications for the next 5 minutes or so. What we've been getting so far is engineering data from these men. They are test pilots, and they've been operating as test pilots right on through this entire mission. No hint in the tone of their voices or at any other time that they feel any concern about the mission, although, of course, they must be disappointed that they aren't going to make the moon landing, that the mission has to be terminated early. Lovell reports that he still cannot see any stars due to the bright reflection of the sun off of the service module. He's apparently not been able to maneuver to put the service module between him and the sun so that he will be in the shadow of the service module. These 3 astronauts, as we have noted throughout, have handled themselves perfectly and handled the problems perfectly so far. What kind of men are they, really? David Shoemaker can tell us more about them. David?
The crew used to joke about Apollo 13, the unlucky number. Jim Lovell, the commander, is anything but superstitious. Fred Hayes, the lunar module pilot, said he wished they could launch on a Friday the 13th. But when Ken Mattingly was bumped, the laughter turned a little bitter, and the new member of the crew, Jack Swigert, was much too busy for jokes. Like Mattingly, Swigert is a bachelor whose life has revolved around flying since he was a youngster. He delivered papers to earn money for his flying lessons. As an astronaut, Swigert has been more serious than in his college days at the University of Colorado, when everyone called him Big Swig, and he was president of his fraternity. In the 2 days before his flight, Swigert took the toughest hazing of his life, proving to a frankly skeptical Jim Lovell that he was ready. It came so fast he didn't even have time to call his family back in Denver. His mother learned the news from a CBS reporter, said only recently her son had told her not to worry. There was no chance he would be substituted in the last 2 weeks before a mission. Jim Lovell resisted the change in his crew for understandable reasons, reasons that had nothing to do with Swigert personally. He had a good deal of pride in the 2 young rookies he had trained with so long. With more time in space than any other man, he knows just how much pressure is involved in a flight, and he likes things done without excitement. Lovell's easygoing manner has always been a delight to his coworkers, who quickly tire of prima donna pilots. Whether the complexity of a lunar landing mission or dealing with reporters, Lovell takes everything in stride.
You feel ready to land on the moon now?
I certainly do. I feel ready to land on the moon.
Here.
No problems about that.